All right, so we're back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that's, well, it's kind of a heavy topic.
Yeah.
We're going to be taking a look at white supremacy and trying to really break it down, what it is, how it shows up, how it impacts people,
Right.
and what we can do about it. So the jumping off point for all of this is an article called Facing the Uncomfortable Truths of White Supremacy, Navigating Survival and Resistance.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the first things that this article really kind of points out is that white supremacy is not just about the overt, like the hate groups and
The really obvious.
the really obvious stuff. It's a lot more insidious than that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of times we think about white supremacy, like you said, as being something that's really overt and really obvious. But the article does a really good job of talking about how white supremacy is really baked into a lot of our systems and institutions. And it can show up in ways that we might not even realize.
Yeah, so what are some examples of that?
Well, it could be anything from housing discrimination or disparities in healthcare,
Okay.
or even just the way that history is taught.
Right.
All of these things can contribute to a system where white people have more power and privilege than people of color.
Okay, so that makes sense. So it's not just about individual acts of racism. It's really about the system that kind of perpetuates itself.
Exactly. And, it's really rooted in history. I mean, if you think about it, white supremacy has its origins in colonialism and slavery.
Right. The article talks about that too.
And those systems, even though they might look different today, they still have a lasting impact on the way that our society is structured.
Okay. So we've kind of touched on the historical roots. The article also goes into these contemporary definitions of white supremacy.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, it's not just burning crosses and, all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's not always that in your face.
Yeah.
It can be things like stereotypes.
Yeah.
The way that certain groups are portrayed in the media.
Yeah.
It can be policies that disadvantage certain groups.
Okay.
Even things like cultural practices that center whiteness as the norm.
Oh, right. I mean, it's interesting you say that because it's almost like these seemingly small or insignificant things kind of build upon each other to create this system where whiteness is at the top.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of systemic racism comes in.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
It's not just about individual prejudice. It's really about racism that's built into the very structure of our society.
Okay, so unpack that a little bit more. What are some of the systems or structures that we're talking about?
Well, you think about our education system.
Okay.
Healthcare.
Yeah.
Law enforcement.
Yeah.
Even our economy. All of these things are impacted by systemic racism.
Okay, so give me a concrete example. How does that actually play out in real life?
So let's take redlining, for example.
Yeah.
The article talks about this. This was a practice where banks would refuse loans to people of color.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
Right, which essentially barred them from buying homes in certain neighborhoods. So what that did is it created these segregated communities.
Right.
It led to this huge wealth gap that continues to this day.
Yeah.
And, even though redlining is illegal now,
Yeah.
the effects are still felt generations later.
Wow. Oh, it's even if someone today isn't consciously racist,
Right.
they might still be benefiting from a system that was built on racist policies.
Exactly. And, it's not just about redlining. Systemic racism limits access to resources and opportunities.
Okay.
It impacts everything from wealth accumulation to health outcomes to representation in media.
I mean, this is heavy stuff.
It is.
But it's so important to understand these concepts.
It is, yeah.
Now, I want to get into how all of this actually impacts people on a personal level.
Okay.
Because the article really doesn't shy away from that. And there's this one quote that really struck me. It says, "A young woman of color may describe the anxiety she feels when encountering an unfamiliar environment, acutely aware that her racial identity may invite hostility or discrimination." And it just paints such a vivid picture.
It does.
Of the constant burden that so many people of color carry.
Yeah. And I think that quote really highlights the psychological and emotional toll of racism.
Yeah.
That hypervigilance, the fear, the feeling of being unsafe simply because of your race.
Right.
And it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it can lead to long-term stress,
Yeah.
trauma, even things like depression and PTSD.
Okay. So it's not just about feeling offended. This
Yeah.
is about real harm.
It is about real harm.
So how do people even begin to cope with that kind of pressure?
Well, I think the article does a really good job of talking about the resilience of marginalized communities.
Okay.
It's about finding strength in shared experiences,
Hmm.
supporting each other, creating these safe spaces. And I think it's also about turning pain into action. You know, there's a long history of resistance
Right.
and activism that has fueled social change.
So even in the face of all this adversity, there's still this powerful spirit of community and determination to fight for justice.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think those personal stories, as difficult as they are to hear, they play a crucial role.
Yeah.
They challenge our assumptions, they force us to confront uncomfortable truths, and they inspire us to work for change.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about something that can be, well, really uncomfortable for a lot of folks.
Okay.
And that's white privilege. It's a term that often gets met with a lot of defensiveness, but the article defines it in a way that I think really resonated with me.
Yeah, how do they define it?
It frames it as unearned advantages that are based solely on race. It's not about guilt.
Right.
It's about understanding that your race can open doors and provide opportunities that other people just don't have. Right, right.
And it's about acknowledging that we don't all start on a level playing field.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think sometimes people hear white privilege and they immediately get defensive.
Right, like it's a personal attack or something.
Exactly. But it's really not about that. It's just about recognizing the reality of how race operates in our society.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought was really interesting is that the article actually poses some pretty tough questions
Oh, like what?
to the reader. Like it asks, have you ever been judged or discriminated against because of your race?
Hmm.
Do you move through spaces without fear because of your race?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these are questions that I think we all need to sit with, even if the answers are uncomfortable.
I think so too, because it really forces us to examine our own experiences
Mhm.
and to see how they might be shaped by race, whether we've been aware of it or not.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, that's when they bump into what the article calls cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, yeah. So that's like when our beliefs clash with reality, right? Yeah, exactly. Like our brains kind of short circuit because we're faced with information that challenges our existing beliefs.
Right. And when it comes to race, that dissonance can be really strong because acknowledging white supremacy means acknowledging systems of oppression that we might be benefiting from, even unintentionally.
Yeah. And that can be a really painful realization. I mean, I think about my own journey with this stuff.
Uh-huh.
And, there have definitely been times where I've experienced that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that for some people, that discomfort can lead to denial
Absolutely.
or defensiveness or even just shutting down completely.
Yeah, it's a natural reaction. When we're faced with something that challenges our worldview, it's easier to just avoid it.
Right. So what can we do about that?
Well, the article stresses the importance of recognizing those reactions.
Oh, okay.
Being willing to sit with that discomfort and to be open to challenging our own perspectives. It's a process.
So in a way, being uncomfortable is actually a good sign.
It can be, yeah. It could be a sign that we're actually engaging in the process of unlearning and relearning.
Right, that we're confronting our own biases.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context. We've talked about systemic racism, the impact on individuals, the role of privilege. We've talked about cognitive dissonance. I mean, this is a lot, right?
It is. It is.
But I think the big question that a lot of people have is, okay, what can we actually do about all this?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right, like how do we move from understanding these concepts to actually taking action?
And that's actually a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about in part 2, which is all about allyship.
Yeah.
And what that looks like in practice.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and dive into that.
Sounds good.
So we've been talking about some pretty intense stuff, like white supremacy and all the ways it shows up in our lives.
Yeah, it can be a lot of process.
It really can. And one thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that, well, engaging in this work can be emotionally draining. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Like it's heavy stuff.
It is. It is. And the article talks about this too. Like it says that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that's such an important point because
it is.
Sometimes we get so caught up in the urgency of it all that we forget to take care of ourselves.
That's so true.
And, the article even talks about how neglecting our well-being can actually lead to burnout.
Right, which ultimately hinders our effectiveness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what are some things that we can do to kind of make sure that we're taking care of ourselves as we're engaging in this work?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to set boundaries. you know?
Yeah.
Like recognizing that we can't do everything all the time.
Yeah.
And it's okay to take breaks when we need them.
Right. Right. And I think sometimes we feel guilty about that,
Oh, for sure.
Like we feel like we should be doing more.
Right. But you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. Exactly. And the article mentioned some other strategies too, right? Like mindfulness.
Yeah, mindfulness is a great one. And just spending time in nature, connecting with supportive communities.
Right. Those are all really good things to keep in mind. The article also talks a lot about the importance of education.
Right, education's huge.
And it actually gives a ton of resources for folks who want to kind of go deeper.
Yeah, it does. And it's really cool because it's a wide range of stuff like they mentioned. Books, podcasts, documentaries, workshops, you name it.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of those.
Okay.
For folks who want to kind of unpack this whole concept of systemic racism,
Okay.
the article suggests White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah.
It really dives into the defensiveness that a lot of white people exhibit when they're confronted with these issues of race and how that defensiveness actually perpetuates the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the title itself, White Fragility, kind of speaks to this idea that white supremacy actually benefits from that fragility.
It does. It does.
And from avoiding these uncomfortable conversations. And then if you're looking for something that's a little bit more practical, like how to actually challenge racism in your own life,
Yeah.
the article recommends How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi.
Another great one. That one really pushes us to move beyond this idea of passive anti-racism,
Yeah.
like just saying, I'm not racist,
Yeah.
and to actually actively work towards dismantling these racist systems.
Okay, so those are some good book recommendations. What about some podcasts?
Oh, there's some great ones out there.
Because I know a lot of people, myself included, learn best through audio.
Yeah, totally. Well, the article highlights 1619 from the New York Times.
Okay.
And it's really interesting because it kind of reframes American history. It puts the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center.
That sounds really good.
It is. It's a very powerful listen.
Yeah, and then if you're looking for something a little more current events focused, a little more solutions oriented,
Yeah.
the article recommends Pod Save the People.
Another great one. That one covers a range of social justice issues, including racial justice, but they really focus on how to create tangible change.
Oh, okay, that.
And podcasts are great because you can listen to them anywhere,
That's true.
While you're like commuting, exercising, doing chores, it fits right into your day.
Right, it's like sneaking in some education.
Exactly, exactly.
The article also mentions some really powerful documentaries that can help us understand these issues on a more visual level.
Yeah, for sure.
And one that stands out to me is 13th.
Yeah, 13th is powerful.
Right.
It explores the history of racial inequality in the U.S.,
Okay.
but specifically the connection between slavery and the mass incarceration system.
Yeah, like how these systems of oppression are often interconnected.
Exactly.
And then for a film that delves into kind of the complexities of white supremacy and the impact of hate groups, the article suggests American History X.
Yeah, that's a classic. It's fictional, but it offers some really important insights into the dangers of prejudice and the possibility of redemption.
Okay, so those are some really good film recommendations. And beyond those specific recommendations, the article also encourages folks to seek out workshops and trainings that really focus on developing skills for allyship.
Yeah, those can be so valuable. You can learn about things like white privilege, microaggressions, how to have those tough conversations about race in a way that's productive and respectful.
Yeah, it's like giving us the tools to be effective allies.
Exactly.
Well, I'm really glad that we have so many resources available now.
It's amazing, right?
It is. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history, the impact, the importance of self-care, all these resources. But the question that keeps coming back to me is, what does a future without white supremacy actually look like?
Yeah, like can we even imagine such a
I don't
thing?
know, right?
It's a big question. But, the article does a really good job of kind of painting a picture of that.
Okay.
Like a world where communities are united across racial lines, where everyone's treated with dignity and respect,
Yeah.
where systems are built on equity and justice, not oppression and exploitation.
I mean, it's a beautiful vision.
It is.
But given how ingrained white supremacy is in our society, I mean, achieving that future seems incredibly challenging.
Oh, it's definitely challenging.
Yeah.
But the article emphasizes the power of hope. Hope is what fuels our actions.
Right.
It keeps us going, even when things feel overwhelming. But we got to remember, hope without action is just wishful thinking.
So it's about channeling that hope into concrete efforts to dismantle white supremacy in all its forms. But I think that's where people get stuck, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Like, where do we even
It
begin?
can feel so overwhelming.
The systems are so vast, the problem feels so immense, it can be really paralyzing.
And that's where I think this idea of collective action comes in.
Yeah.
We can't do this alone. We need to build coalitions, work across different movements and communities. And I think it's also important to recognize that all forms of oppression are interconnected.
So it's not just about focusing on racial justice in isolation.
It's
It's about understanding that these struggles are all intertwined
right.
and working together to create a more just world for everyone.
Absolutely. We need to show up for each other's struggles, amplify each other's voices, and leverage our collective power to push for systemic change.
Yeah, I
Uh,
love that idea of leveraging our collective power. I'm curious, are there any specific examples that the article gives of how we can actually get involved?
yeah, one thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on supporting grassroots movements.
Okay.
Community organizations that are on the front lines of this work.
So groups that are led by people from the communities most impacted by white supremacy.
Exactly.
And they're doing the work to address the root causes.
They are.
Do you have any specific example of like organizations that people can look into?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article mentions expert speaker, lists the names of several organizations, and these groups are doing amazing work. They're tackling issues like police brutality, mass incarceration, educational inequities, environmental racism. I mean, the list goes on.
That's incredible. And supporting these organizations, I mean, it can take many forms, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have to be financial.
Right.
We can volunteer our time, we can donate our skills, we can spread awareness about their work on social media, we can attend their events, even just offer words of encouragement and support.
Right.
Every little bit helps.
I love that. Okay, well, as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to reflect on. What's one specific action you can take this week to challenge white supremacy in your own life or community? It could be something small, like having a conversation with a friend or family member, or something bigger, like joining a local organization or attending a protest.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we'll be back in part 3 to explore even more ways to turn awareness into action and to discuss what it really means to build a more just and equitable world for everyone.
As we're getting back into this conversation about white supremacy, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by like the enormity of it all.
Oh, absolutely. Like where you even start, right?
Right, exactly. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of get stuck.
Yeah.
Like they understand the concepts, they see the problem, but then it's like, okay, what can I actually do about it?
Right. I mean, it's easy to feel like your individual actions aren't going to make a difference.
Yeah.
But what I think is important to remember is that change happens both at the systemic level
Okay.
and through those individual choices. Every action we take, even if it seems small, contributes to shifting the tide.
So how do we bridge that gap between feeling overwhelmed and actually doing something?
Well, that's where the article comes in. It actually offers some concrete steps, and I thought maybe we could break those down.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, cool. So one of the most powerful things we can do is start having these honest and open conversations about race
Okay.
with the people in our lives.
So like our friends, family, colleagues?
Exactly. It can be uncomfortable,
Oh, for sure.
but it's essential, for raising awareness, challenging misconceptions, building empathy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people avoid these conversations because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing
Oh, I know. I've been there.
or being perceived as racist.
Yeah, that's a common fear.
So do you have any advice for how to navigate that? Like, what do we do if we want to have these conversations, but we're feeling kind of scared?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that it's not about being perfect.
Okay.
It's about being willing to engage in the process with humility and a genuine desire to learn.
So being open to making mistakes.
Exactly.
Mm.
We're all on a learning journey here.
Right.
And as long as we're open to feedback and committed to growth, it's okay to stumble a bit.
So approach it with curiosity and a willingness to listen.
Exactly. Even when it's challenging.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there are resources out there that can help us have those conversations more effectively, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's some great organizations like Race Forward and Showing Up for Racial Justice.
Okay.
They offer workshops and toolkits that provide guidance on how to engage in these conversations about race constructively.
Awesome. I'll have to check those out.
Yeah, they're great.
Okay, so we've talked about conversations. What about supporting organizations that are doing this work on the ground?
Yeah, those grassroots groups and nonprofits are crucial.
Okay.
Remember those organizations we talked about in the last part?
Yeah.
They're all fighting for racial justice in different ways,
Yeah.
and they really rely on support from people like us.
And that support, it doesn't always have to be financial,
Yeah.
right?
It can be volunteering, donating your skills, amplifying their messages on social media, or even just showing up at events and rallies.
Right.
Even small acts of support can have a huge impact.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is political activism.
Oh, yeah, that's huge, especially in today's climate.
Like voting in local and national elections to elect officials who are committed to racial justice.
Absolutely. And contacting our representatives to advocate for policies that address systemic racism.
So things like criminal justice reform, affordable housing, equitable access to healthcare and education.
Exactly. It's about using our voices and our votes to hold those in power accountable and create a world that's more just.
I like that. Okay, what about this? The article also mentions supporting businesses owned by people of color.
Oh, yeah, that's a really important one.
Why is that so crucial in the fight against white supremacy?
Well, when we support businesses owned by people of color, we're not only creating economic opportunities for communities that have been historically marginalized,
Right.
we're also challenging those systemic economic disparities that are a direct result of white supremacy.
So it's like a concrete way to fight back against economic inequality
Exactly.
and promote racial justice through our everyday choices.
Yeah, like choosing to buy groceries from a locally owned shop run by a person of color instead of a big chain store.
Right. And every dollar we spend is kind of like a vote for the kind of world we want to create.
It is. It is. And those small choices can add up to big changes.
Okay, so we've talked about having conversations, supporting organizations, political action, supporting businesses. What else can we do?
I think one of the most important things is committing to ongoing education
Oh.
about the history and impacts of white supremacy. Reading books, listening to podcasts, watching documentaries, attending workshops, really engaging with the diverse perspectives.
It's like being a lifelong learner.
Exactly. Recognizing that this work is never really done.
Right, it's a journey.
It is. And the more we learn, the more equipped we are to challenge our own biases and dismantle these systems of oppression.
You know what I'm realizing is that this work isn't just about these grand gestures.
Yeah.
It's about those small everyday choices that we make.
Absolutely.
Like being mindful of the language we use, the media we consume, the ways that we interact with the world around us.
It's about integrating anti-racism into every aspect of our lives.
Right.
Yeah, and recognizing that it's an ongoing process.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have. It's been a journey.
It really has, from unpacking the definitions of white supremacy and the impact it has,
Right.
to exploring allyship and self-care and all the ways we can take action.
And I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to make a difference.
Me too. Me too.
Mm.
I think it's important to remember that this work is ongoing.
Yeah.
It's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
It is.
And there will be setbacks, there will be challenges, but we can't give up hope.
We can't.
This fight for racial justice is a fight for the soul of our nation, and it's a fight worth having.
Absolutely beautifully said.
And we don't have to do it alone, right?
Not at all.
There are so many people and organizations out there working towards the same goal.
Exactly.
Find your community, find your allies, and let's keep pushing forward together.
That's it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.